How we doing, Reginald?
I'm fine. Good.
So let me ask you this question to start off with. I know you mentioned your name several times throughout the book. How would you like to be called? Mr. Betts, Reginald?
Dwayne is fine.
Dwayne?
Yeah.
Dwayne, I feel honored actually to be to interview someone like you. I read your book, and it's very powerful stories in there about your life, what you depict, and the way you articulate, and the way you describe, some of the scenes of what you went through. And I guess one of the questions I wanted to start off by just pretty much asking, like, what motivated you to write your book?
So two things, just in case somebody in the audience doesn't know who I am. So my name is Reginald Dwayne Betts, and he asked me about names at the start of it. So I'll say that I'm named after my father, but everybody calls me Dwayne, which is interesting. And then I think later on I'll get into why people call me Shaheed while I was in prison. But I wrote a memoir called A Question of Freedom. I was incarcerated when I was 16 for carjacking, and I did 8.5 years in prison. And your question was?
What motivated you to write your book? And,
right.
and
So,
not only that, but what makes your book any different from any other books that are out there that are written about prison or inmates?
Right, and so the interesting thing is I got arrested when I was 16. I had never committed a crime before, never been arrested before. And I had a gun, and it was my first time ever having a gun. And I felt like, you know how you hear those news, the stories on the news about somebody did X for the first time and you never believe it? And I was just suddenly trapped into this world where I didn't even believe my own story. Like, I knew that I had to be lying, and there's no way that I could have committed a crime of this nature, and it was the only crime I ever committed. And then I thought, how do you really explain this? And not only how do I explain it to myself, but how would I go about explaining it to my mom and explaining it to the rest of my family? And particularly in light of the fact that I had been a reader before I got incarcerated. I read Nathan McCall Makes Me Wanna Holler. I had read books about prison that people had never heard of, like Albert Sample's Racehorse. And also, I had just thought of incarceration and what it meant to the black community before committing my crime, and yet I still robbed somebody. And so I decided I wanted to be a writer while I was in prison, and part of the impulse was to write as a means of finding an explanation to my own narrative. And when I finally got the opportunity to write the book, that was the main reason why I wanted to write the book. And also, you know, what I found different is every book that I can name and that I could think of that's about prison sort of has this natural arc of the person's life. It's typically before prison, prison, and after prison. And when it's framed that way, you get to have a real good feeling about the person that committed the crime. You know, because in some ways they have done something that's heroic or something that's commendable to get to the place to write the actual book. But in feeling something good about the person that wrote the book, I think you stop thinking about what it means to be in prison. I think you stop thinking about the justice system and what it means to our country. And so I wanted to write a book that, one, said what it meant to be a juvenile in prison, and two, I wanted the book to essentially end with me just leaving prison, so that, you know, you had no idea what would happen to me, because I had no idea what would happen to me. And in that way, instead of the book totally being a focus on me, it could start a conversation about the role of the justice system in our various communities.
You know, one of the things you mentioned, you were 16, right, when you first caught your case. Am I correct? So you're 16 years old, juvenile, and you were facing pretty much, you know, as if you would have been charged an adult life sentence. Something that I really took from your book, and even hearing you now, and from our conversation that we had the other day, is that we have all these policies that affect juveniles, that affect adults, and all these policymakers are not necessarily, you know, people like you or myself. And I say that because, you know, again, being in the same, walking the same shoes you walked in the past, you know, I could definitely relate to a lot of the stuff that I read there. But my point is that often the stories that are shared by a lot of the people that have been in the prison system are not necessarily echoed in a very positive way. And what you've done, you've taken this negative experience of going to prison, you know, but also, you know, you took ownership of what happened, you know. you never really denied all this stuff, but you did explain thoroughly about what led to it and then what you did with that time while you were there. And it's evident through your book, the struggles you've seen, a lot of disparity, inequality, how certain population are marginalized. And I just wondered, like, now that you wrote the book, like, what's become of all that?
Well, I mean, I guess I could say that one of the things that writing the book did was give me the opportunity to go to different high schools, different colleges, to speak on different panels and actually to speak at different congressional briefings about some of the policy issues that go into incarceration. Because I think about it, when I got locked up at 16, my mom had no idea that juveniles could be tried as adults. And she had no real reason to know. And but a few years after I got locked up, I had a little cousin that got locked up. And what happens is, what I wanted to do is to start a conversation in the community that went to how do you prevent crime, but also how do you confront what's going on and what's happening to young people who are, who make terrible mistakes. But put it in perspective. At 16, I went to prison. The judge sentenced me. He told me, I'm under no illusion that sending you to prison will help. I was sentenced to 9 years. So even if I did that time day for day, I'll be released as 25. I'll be a young man when I was released. And the judge understood that when I was sentenced. But it was nothing in prison, one, set in place to protect me if I needed protection, but two, set in place that helped me usher myself into adulthood, given that, I was barely old enough to get a driver's license. And so some of the conversations that I have now in terms of trying to connect my experience to policy, because I think it's one thing for me to talk about my experience, and I think in some world, and in some ways, that's important because I have funny stories. I haven't told any, but I have a couple of funny stories about what it means to be in prison. And it's something to be said about just the experience, about, what it means to go through something difficult. And I think it's something relevant to be said about that. And that's why I appreciate the sort of idea of a memoir. But I also think it's something to be said about policy and looking at my experience. And there haven't been many that I can name, or many maybe that have had national prominence, that have had the opportunity to connect their troubles to larger policy issues. And I want, in time, to be able to do that and to be able to, in some ways, disconnect my troubles from the policy issues that I discuss. I haven't been able to do that yet, but in time I want to be able to do that, because the reality is I do think that the experience that I have makes me able to discuss some things in a way and with nuance that somebody else may not. But sometimes it's hard for people to even hear that because they always connect what I say to my trouble. So they don't hear somebody who could possibly be an expert on policy issues. They may really only hear a 16-year-old. And I mean, they say I have a baby face, I don't know, but I'm absolutely certain that I'm no longer 16 years old. And at some point there has to be a place in which, when you ask somebody to be a part of a discussion, that they could be a part of the discussion based on the skills that they earned to contribute, and not just based on the troubles that they've dealt with.
Right. It's interestingly enough too, based on that conversation that we had the other day, we're talking about, some of the challenges that we've had, with some of the success, right? A lot of times people think that it just happens overnight. Sometimes people think that there's more to this, what they're seeing. There's more behind the current. And the truth of the matter is that, obviously I've seen how nationally you've been involved in different discussions and even as a consultant and just doing a lot of work, not only in the community but across the nation. And interestingly enough, I've had the honor to be one of the main subjects in this documentary called The Interrupters, which we kind of joked about it because when I introduced myself, I'm like, I'm Eddie, and you're like, yeah, okay. And then I told you, well, I had this honor, this privilege of being part of this documentary called The Interrupters. And you were like, man, I just saw that film last month, and I was like, yeah, well, that's me, But
it was sad because I thought he was the kid that got shot, and I was like,
yeah.
I was like, Eddie, man, it's hard work. And then he was like, no, that wasn't me. I was like, oh, good. I mean,
no, I was like the other guy, the one that was working with the kids painting and stuff like that. But so we were kind of just joking about that. But it's amazing because no matter how much we struggled and how much we think that we've done good and how much we've tried to change our lives, like there's always critics out there and skeptics, and so my question, like I've had my challenges, but how's that affected you? You know, as far as like people, how the way they see you now, and I mean, do they really look at you as someone who's like really giving